"The paperwork is signed, Sergeant. My hands are tied. He's a danger to the staff and a liability to this installation. We've given him every chance." The voice was flat, bureaucratic, a sound of resigned finality that grated on the raw grief in the air. "He lunged at Dr. Evans yesterday. That was the last straw. The appointment is for 1600. A younger voice, tight with emotion, pushed back. "Sir, with all due respect, Shadow isn't a liability. He's a hero. He's grieving. His handler, Staff Sergeant Thorne, they were inseparable. You can't just put him down like a piece of broken equipment." The first voice, belonging to a civilian contractor named Caldwell, who managed the base kennels, sighed with practiced patience. "I understand your sentiment, Sergeant Davis. I truly do. But sentiment doesn't prevent a 110-pound Malinois with a bite force that can snap a femur from taking someone's arm off. He's reverted. He's feral. He won't respond to a single command. It's a tragedy, but it's a closed case." From a quiet corner of the base library's periodical section, where the scent of old paper and floor wax hung in the still air, a woman looked up from the newspaper she wasn't reading. Alara Finch was a fixture, a volunteer who came in 3 days a week to reshelve books and mend torn pages. She was a whisper in the library's ecosystem, small and neat, with silver hair pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense bun. Her clothes were functional, sensible shoes, a faded cardigan, gray slacks, and seemed to help her blend into the background of dusty shelves and quiet study carols. But it was the way she held herself that was different, a detail lost on most. Her posture was not the stoop of age, but a ramrod stillness, an economy of energy that was both serene and deeply alert. When she moved, it was without a single wasted motion. She folded the newspaper with precise, deliberate movements, her hands marked with the fine lines of age, but steady as a surgeon's, smoothing the creases perfectly. She had heard the conversation through the open library door, the two men standing just outside in the sterile hallway of the administrative building. She felt the young sergeant's pain like a physical ache, a familiar ghost from a life she had packed away decades ago. She understood the cold, risk-averse logic of the contractor. Both were right in their own worlds, and both were about to make a terrible mistake. Alara rose from her chair, the wooden legs making no sound against the polished linoleum. She placed the folded paper on a stack for recycling and walked towards the door. Sergeant Davis was leaning against the wall, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his face pale. Caldwell stood with his arms crossed, his expression a careful mask of professional sympathy that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was a man who dealt in protocols and procedures, not in the invisible wounds of a warrior, canine or otherwise. Alara paused in the doorway, her presence so unobtrusive that it took them a moment to notice her. When Caldwell finally did, his eyes flickered over her with dismissive politeness. Just the old library volunteer. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone shifting to one used for civilians and small children. Alara's gaze wasn't on him. It was on the young sergeant. She saw the telltale signs, the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands, the unfocused pain in his eyes. He was reliving something. He was standing on the precipice of a loss he felt powerless to stop, and it was echoing other losses, other moments of helplessness. "I heard you talking about the dog," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying a strange resonance that made both men straighten up slightly. "Shadow." Caldwell's professional mask slipped back on. "It's a sad situation, ma'am, but it's an internal matter for base personnel." It was a gentle but firm wall. "You don't belong here. This is not your concern." Alara didn't argue or raise her voice. She simply held his gaze. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, but they had a depth that was unsettling. They didn't plead or challenge. They simply saw. "What was his handler's specialty?" she asked, the question so specific, so out of place, that it momentarily broke through Caldwell's script. Sergeant Davis looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Staff Sergeant Thorne was TACP, Tactical Air Control Party. They were usually attached to Special Forces units. Alara gave a single, slow nod, a universe of understanding contained in the simple gesture. "Pashto or Dari?" she asked, another question that hung in the air like a chord of music no one else knew how to play. Davis's brow furrowed. "Thorne was fluent in both, ma'am. He trained Shadow using a mix, mostly Pashto for the action commands. He was answering her automatically, the specificity of her questions commanding a professional courtesy he hadn't even realized he was giving. Caldwell was growing impatient. This is all very interesting, but it doesn't change the facts. The dog is unstable. Alara finally turned her full attention to him. A tool is only as good as the person who knows how to use it, she said softly. He's not unstable. He's waiting for a command that no one here knows how to give. Caldwell's face tightened with irritation. He was used to being the authority, the final word. This quiet elderly woman was questioning his professional assessment with a certainty that was both baffling and infuriating. Ma'am, with all due respect, we have the best handlers, the best veterinarians. We have his entire file. We've tried every command, every technique. The dog is a lost cause. He said the last words with a grim finality, glancing at Sergeant Davis as if to say, "See? It's over." But Davis was no longer looking at him. He was staring at Alara Finch, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. The questions she'd asked, they weren't civilian questions. They weren't even standard military questions. They were insider questions, honed and specific, hinting at a level of knowledge he couldn't place. Alara ignored Caldwell's pronouncement. Her focus remained laser-sharp. "Let me see him," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of intent. Caldwell almost laughed. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. "Absolutely not. It's far too dangerous. He's in isolation for a reason. I can't have a civilian getting mauled on my watch. The liability is—" "I'll sign any waiver you want," Alara interrupted, her voice still quiet, but now laced with a thread of steel. "I am not a liability, Mr. Caldwell. I am a solution." For the first time, Caldwell was at a loss for words. The sheer, unshakable confidence in her was unnerving. She didn't seem eccentric or foolish. She seemed competent. It was an aura that radiated from her, clashing violently with her unassuming appearance. It was in the way she stood, balanced perfectly on the balls of her feet, ready to move. It was in her controlled, even breathing. Sergeant Davis, sensing a shift in the dynamic, seized the opening. "Sir, what's the harm? Let her try. I'll go with her. I'll take full responsibility." He looked from Caldwell to Alara, his initial despair being replaced by a fragile, desperate hope. He didn't know who this woman was, but she was the first person to talk about Shadow like he was still a soldier, not a case number. Caldwell looked back and forth between the earnest young sergeant and the unnervingly calm old woman. Every regulation in his book screamed no. But something in Alara's eyes, a look that said she had faced down far worse things than a grieving dog and a stubborn bureaucrat, made him hesitate. He was a man of checklists and protocols, and for the first time, he was faced with a variable he couldn't quantify. Against his better judgment, he heard himself say, "Fine, 5 minutes, from the observation window only. The second he gets agitated, it's over, and you both sign waivers." He turned on his heel and strode down the hall, the jingle of his keys sounding like a death knell. Alara simply nodded and fell into step behind him, her movements fluid and silent. The kennel block was a world away from the quiet library. It smelled of antiseptic, dog food, and the faint metallic tang of fear. The air hummed with low whines and the occasional sharp bark, but as they approached the isolation run at the far end, a heavy silence fell. It was a silence born of respect and dread from the other animals. They knew who was at the end of the hall. Shadow's kennel was reinforced steel mesh. Inside, the dog was a coiled spring of muscle and fury. He wasn't barking or whining. He stood in the center of the concrete floor, perfectly still, his head low, his golden eyes burning with a cold fire. His black-tipped fur bristled along his spine. He was a magnificent, terrifying creature, a living weapon with no one to wield it. When he saw Caldwell, a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the floor. It was not a warning, it was a promise. "See?" Caldwell said, staying a safe 10 feet from the door. "That's as close as anyone's gotten in 2 days. He's locked on, threat-focused. He sees everything as a target." Sergeant Davis stood beside him, his heart sinking. The dog, he remembered, the loyal partner who would rest his heavy head in your lap, the fiercely intelligent animal who could distinguish the scent of 14 different explosive compounds, was gone. In his place was this ghost, this creature of pure, undiluted rage. Alara, however, walked right past them. She stopped directly in front of the kennel door, just inches from the mesh. She didn't flinch. She didn't make a sound. The growl intensified, the dog's lip curling to reveal a formidable set of white teeth. Caldwell tensed, ready to pull her back. Davis held his breath, but Alara did nothing. She simply stood there, her body relaxed, her breathing slow and deep. She wasn't looking at the dog as a threat. She was observing. Her eyes scanned him, not with fear, but with a kind of professional assessment. She noted the precise angle of his ears, the tension in his haunches, the slight tremor in his back leg. She was reading a language that Caldwell and even Davis had forgotten how to speak. She saw past the aggression. She saw the source. He wasn't feral. He was on watch. He was guarding the last known position of his handler, and in his traumatized mind, that position was this concrete box. Everything outside of it was a potential threat to a man who was no longer there. For a full minute, there was only the sound of the dog's rumbling growl and Alara's impossibly steady breathing. She was creating a space of calm in a storm of aggression, a pocket of stillness that seemed to confuse the animal. His growl faltered for a second, the rhythm breaking as he tried to process this new stimulus. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't a handler trying to force compliance. She wasn't prey. She was just there, present, unafraid. Caldwell started to speak, to call an end to the 5 minutes, but Davis put a hand on his arm, shaking his head silently. He was witnessing something he didn't understand, but he knew it was important. He was watching a master at work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Alara spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, a soft, low murmur that was almost lost in the acoustics of the concrete room. It wasn't a command, it was a sound, a gentle crooning note followed by a single word. The word wasn't English, it wasn't Pashto, it wasn't Dari. It was a short, guttural word from a language few people had ever heard, a dialect spoken only in a remote mountainous region where Thorne's unit had spent a harrowing 18 months on a mission whose details were still classified. It was a word that meant safe, or stand down, or the watch is over. It was a release, and it was a word that only Thorne and the person who had trained him would know. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside the dog's brain. The growl cut off mid-rumble. The bristling fur on his back smoothed down. The coiled tension in his body dissolved, his muscles going slack. Shadow blinked, his head tilting. He took one step forward, then another, his claws clicking softly on the concrete. He whined, a high, mournful sound, the first sound he had made that wasn't a threat. It was a question. He pressed his head against the steel mesh, his body trembling, his golden eyes fixed on Alara. The cold fire was gone, replaced by a deep, bottomless well of confusion and grief. He was no longer a weapon. He was just a dog who had lost his person. Caldwell stared, his mouth hanging open. He looked from the now docile dog to the small, elderly woman, his mind utterly failing to compute what he had just witnessed. All his protocols, his risk assessments, his carefully constructed certainty, it had all evaporated in the space of a single, incomprehensible word. He was speechless, his authority rendered meaningless by a display of knowledge so profound it felt like magic. But Sergeant Davis was not just seeing magic, he was seeing a ghost. He didn't know the word, but he recognized its function. It was a failsafe, a deep-level psychological key taught only in the most advanced, most secretive MWD handler programs. These were programs that had been phased out years ago, programs whose founders were the stuff of legend, their names spoken in hushed, reverent tones at handler schools. They were pioneers, psychologists as much as trainers, who understood the deep symbiotic bond between operator and animal. They knew how to build a warrior, but more importantly, they knew how to bring one home. His eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. The posture, the economy of movement, the impossibly specific questions about TACP and local dialects, the unnerving calm. Alara Finch wasn't just a library volunteer. She couldn't be. He was looking at a living piece of history. "Ma'am," he breathed, the word full of a dawning, incredulous respect. "Who are you?" Alara didn't look at him. She kept her attention on Shadow, her fingers slipping through the mesh to gently stroke the soft fur behind his ears. The dog leaned into her touch, a low, contented rumble replacing the growl. "I'm just someone who believes that no soldier should be left behind," she said, her voice soft but firm. She turned her head slightly, her pale blue eyes meeting Caldwell's shocked gaze. "He's not broken, Mr. Caldwell. He's stuck in his last command set. His handler is gone, so the all clear was never given. He's been holding a defensive perimeter for a week, alone in his head. He needs to be formally decommissioned, not destroyed." Her words were a quiet rebuke, a lesson delivered without malice. She was explaining the complex psychology of a combat-stressed animal with the simple clarity of someone who had written the book on it. She was teaching them, not shaming them. She was showing them the path forward. Caldwell, to his credit, was smart enough to recognize when he was hopelessly out of his depth. The arrogance and impatience had vanished, replaced by a humbled, stunned silence. He looked at the dog, now acting like a perfectly normal, affectionate animal, and then at the woman whose quiet authority had achieved in 2 minutes what his entire staff couldn't in 2 weeks. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly. He unlocked the kennel door and swung it open. What does he need?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He had ceded command. He was asking for orders. "He needs a purpose," Alara said, not moving from her spot. "But first he needs to be told that his tour is over. He needs to be walked through a full stand-down sequence in order in the language he was trained in. It has to be done right, or he'll just lock back up the next time he's stressed." She finally straightened up, her back as straight as a young soldier's, and looked at Sergeant Davis. A flicker of something passed between them, a shared understanding of duty, of sacrifice. "You knew Staff Sergeant Thorne," she said. "You can do it. I'll walk you through it." It was an offer of mentorship, a passing of the torch. Davis felt a surge of emotion so strong it almost buckled his knees. He was being invited into a world he had only read about, to be taught by a legend he never knew existed. He nodded, unable to speak, his throat thick. He stepped forward, his earlier fear gone, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer just trying to save a dog, he was honoring a fallen comrade and upholding a sacred trust. He was being shown the true meaning of the handler's creed. Alara began to speak in low tones, giving Davis a series of soft commands in the same obscure dialect. Simple things first. Words for sit, heel, watch me. Davis repeated them, his pronunciation clumsy at first, but with Alara's gentle correction, he found the rhythm. Shadow responded to Davis instantly, his training taking over, his eyes locking onto the young sergeant with focus and trust, but he kept his body angled towards Alara, his anchor in the storm. Over the next hour, the concrete kennel block transformed into a place of quiet healing. Alara guided Davis through the intricate ballet of decommissioning a high-level working dog. It was more than just commands, it was ritual. It involved specific movements, tones of voice, even patterns of breathing. It was a process designed to systematically deactivate every combat trigger, to tell the dog on a primal, instinctual level that the war was over, that he was home, that he had done his duty. Caldwell watched from a distance, silent and humbled. He saw Alara gently correct Davis's posture, showing him how to shift his weight to signal safety and calm to the animal. He heard her explain the why behind every command, how this word released the hypervigilance for tripwires, how that tone of voice deactivated the aggression response. He was getting a masterclass in a field he thought he understood, and he realized he had only ever been skimming the surface. He had seen a problem to be managed. She saw a soldier to be healed. He had seen an animal. She saw a partner. The final command was a single word, the same one she had used to break through. Tashakor. Thank you. And then, in English, she told Davis to say, "Your watch is over. Rest now." Davis knelt, his voice thick with emotion, and repeated the words. Shadow looked at him, then at Alara, and for the first time in a week, he laid down, rested his head on his paws, and let out a long, deep sigh. It was the sound of a burden being set down, the sound of peace. The entire kennel block, which had been silent, seemed to sigh with him. Later, after Shadow had been moved to a quiet, comfortable run with a soft bed and a bowl of fresh water, Davis found Alara by the entrance, getting ready to return to the library. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. "I won't ask for your name," Davis said, his voice full of reverence. "Your real name, I mean. Or your old unit. I know that's not my place, but I have to know. The K7 program. The Shepherd Protocols. Was that you?" Alara paused, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "A long time ago," she said. "We just wanted to make sure they all came home. The dogs, too." She looked at him, her pale eyes searching his. "The knowledge is no good if it isn't passed on, Sergeant. Thorne was one of the best. That legacy, it's in you now. Don't waste it." He could only nod, his heart too full for words. He wanted to salute her, but he knew it would be the wrong gesture. The respect she commanded wasn't the kind that required formal acknowledgement. It was deeper, more fundamental. He simply stood taller, his shoulders back, a renewed sense of purpose settling over him. He wasn't just a handler anymore. He was a steward of a sacred trust. Alara adjusted her cardigan and turned to leave. "Mr. Caldwell has my number," she said over her shoulder. "If you need help with the rest of Shadow's debriefing, call me. I'm usually at the library until 1700. And with that, she was gone. A small, unassuming woman walking into the twilight, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the asphalt. She blended back into the world, her extraordinary past hidden once more beneath a quiet, ordinary present. Caldwell came over and stood beside Davis, both men watching her go. "I was about to sign a death warrant for a hero," Caldwell said, his voice heavy with the weight of his near mistake. "Because I was following a checklist. I'll be rewriting our entire evaluation protocol tonight." Davis nodded, his gaze still on the spot where Alara had disappeared. "I don't think she'd want you to throw out the checklist, sir," he said thoughtfully. "I think she'd just want you to add a new question to it." Caldwell looked at him. "And what's that?" Sergeant Davis turned, a new confidence in his eyes, the quiet authority of his mentor now echoing in his own voice. "Have we tried listening in their own language?" The question hung in the evening air, a simple truth that had almost been forgotten. It was a lesson learned not in a classroom or from a manual, but in a concrete kennel, from a quiet librarian who knew that the deepest wounds can only be healed by those who speak the language of the broken, and that the greatest strength is often found in the gentlest touch. The watch was over for one soldier and just beginning for another.